Hello and welcome to Conversations from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. In this episode, Fran shares her story of being adopted and growing up with knowledge of extremely challenging circumstances in her biological family. The usual warning stands, but it's worth emphasising in Fran's story that there are some really challenging aspects that are difficult to listen to. So as always, listen with caution. And if you have any doubts, then ask a friend to listen for you first. We hope you find it helpful and thought-provoking, and if you're an adoptee and would like to share your perspective or experience, then please do direct messages at our Twitter feed or on our Facebook page.
My name's Fran. I am an adult adoptee.
Excellent. So I've known you quite a while, Fran, and met you on a few occasions, and so, are you comfortable telling your story?
I am nervous, as I'm sure lots of people are when they share their vulnerabilities with people.
Yeah.
But I am happy to share some of my story.
Cool. So, away you go.
Away you go. So obviously, lots to it. I was in foster care for the first year and a half of my life. I was removed when I was a baby. That was what, I was told. I had a letter that explained why I was removed from my biological mother, and it was simply that, she couldn't care for me. I was adopted between I was introduced to my adoptive parents 1.5 maybe, adopted around the age of 2. I would like to think that I did grow up reasonably content, and then when I was a teenager, I accidentally discovered lots of newspapers, and obviously it took me a while to kind of understand what these newspapers were and what relevance they had to me, but I started to realise that they did have relevance to me. And I discovered from the newspapers that my sibling, who I kind of was aware of but never met, didn't know a lot about, I discovered that she was murdered when she was age 7, and that it was my biological mother who murdered her. Because I found the newspapers accidentally, I didn't tell anyone that I'd found them, and I didn't tell anyone that I knew what I knew. And my life kind of drastically went downhill from there. So a couple of years later, I was, my behaviour had changed. There were things about life that weren't the same as before. So eventually, I told my parents that I'd found these newspapers.
Yeah, even just you telling me that is quite remarkable, and there's a lot to unpack there. So can I ask you sort of a bit of background to that, in that did you know you were an adopted child? Were your adoptive parents open in relation to that?
Mum and Dad are white, so yeah, always known that I'm adopted.
Right, because how would you describe yourself?
Do you know something? I really don't have a clue.
Right.
I find that an incredibly challenging question, actually.
Right.
When you have to fill out No. I'm just being honest. When you have to fill out the ethnic origin form, doctor's surgery, or you have to tick the box, I'm very unsure what box I should be ticking.
Is that because of a lack of knowledge, or just not having an uncertain sense of who you are?
I think it's a sense of who I am. I still feel like there's am I going to get this wrong if I say this is who I am? And I think that kind of runs through a lot of aspects of my life. I don't think it's just, ethnicity. I think it's yeah.
So you knew. that you knew you were adopted? It was obvious.
Yes. Yeah.
And was that an open sort of environment where you could discuss that, or was it just sort of matter of fact and we all move on?
I think it was quite matter of fact. I have siblings, obviously their stories are not for me to share.
Yeah.
We're all on different journeys, I guess. So that adds another dimension, doesn't it, to who we are.
Mm-hmm. So you said you were fairly content as a child growing up, which is not uncommon, but obviously this sort of catastrophic revelation. Did people notice then this difference in your behaviour and your presentation?
I would say so, yes.
So, and what did they attribute that to? Was there any sense of sort of inquiry or curiosity as to what had happened?
I think some came down to the age, so
right.
Teenager.
Yeah.
So, this typical teenage behaviour. But I was obviously doing quite, I wanted to stay in my room. I didn't like the curtains opened. I wanted to feel very hidden. I think because of the severity of what I found, there was lots of implications to the context of what I found as well. For example, I was in those newspapers, so I felt like everybody knew who I was.
Right.
I also felt very unsafe. I felt like somebody was going to come and get me.
So can you tell us the story that you found in the newspapers? What was the narrative and where did you fit in?
So the narrative was evil mother. There was lots of different stories in different papers, as I'm sure you can imagine, because it was a high profile case. So, but that was obviously my first.
Yeah.
I didn't have anything to compare it to.
So that was the truth.
So that was the truth, of course. And obviously it was mentioned that my biological mother had another child who was adopted. And in the papers, I also found out that I was actually abused as a baby by her.
And you'd not known that previously?
No, because my letter that you get when you get adopted was I was just a baby who couldn't be looked after.
So that language around, your mummy couldn't look after you, which is very bland and says nothing really, does it?
No, and also interestingly enough is, the assumption that you can be neatly packaged off that way and nothing is going to happen parallel to the life that you're given.
Yeah. Wow. So the story is that your sibling was then killed.
Yes.
And your parents knew. Your adoptive parents knew. Because
it was that happened 5 years after. So 5 years after.
Yeah.
And because it was a high-profile case, obviously it was all in the news.
Where do you even start to make sense of that? Tell me about what happens after. You've sort of mentioned it goes to quite a dark place, but come on, tell me. Can you tell me? Sorry.
Of course, yeah. It leads you to think lots of things. I mean, the newspapers itself led me to think that what happened was my fault. I felt like it should have been me that should have been murdered, and that I felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt for what happened. And again, because obviously newspapers make big stories out of people's lives, I was also portrayed as a saved child in the newspaper, which, as you know, there's a common narrative around that, isn't there, if you're an adoptee. And that's quite hard to, it isn't as simple as that. Yes, effectively I have been saved, but what I've had to outlive has been incredibly challenging.
Yeah. So how did this play out? Because I know that you are, I know that it's someone you talk and you support families and other adopted adults, and you've gone on quite a journey, because you're not that teenager anymore, are you? So what can you tell me more about that journey from what sounds like a really difficult point in your life to, what then moved that story on?
So obviously that story didn't move on for quite a long time.
Right.
For reasons that, obviously that many years ago, 20 odd years ago, we were a less trauma-informed society.
Yeah.
So some of the support that I got when, it was decided that maybe I, needed some support, was very, if you have this support, then in 6 weeks' time, you'll be okay, and you can just move on. So that was one of the kind of themes. If you just engage with this, then everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
My first experience of working with a social worker who supported adopted individuals, she suggested that one of the things that might be really helpful was that I go and visit my biological mother.
I'm kind of, my mouth chopped open, you're waiting for me to say something, and I was kind of, right. But they didn't know. Did she know what you knew?
She knew. So that was my first experience of, sharing. And what I found was that, if you think flight, fight and freeze, my flight, fight and freeze was going off the scale. Yeah.
Wow.
And that then became, a negative experience. I then kept thinking, every time I talk about this, someone's going to want to send me to my biological mother. And it's amazing how that just gets bigger and bigger. And the world actually got more frightening, and it got smaller rather than bigger.
So that's bringing the danger into what is supposed to be a very safe place. A therapeutic environment is meant to be this, really comfortable, secure, but actually all of a sudden someone's bringing that danger in there. That is.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was my first experience of working with a social worker within adoption, and my first experience of counselling, which again was, if you just go and see someone, if you go and talk to someone, she obviously, and fair enough, it's not a situation that I expect. Lots of people don't have the awareness of a situation such as this. But my first experience of counselling was that she, at the end of my first session, she wanted to pray for me so we could get rid of all the evil.
So that's a very specific type of therapeutic intervention, isn't it? I'm dancing around that. Yes. Is that part of DDP or something? I don't know. I mean, you're laughing now.
But it really wasn't funny. And then what happened with that was, again, that became a trauma in itself. So every time I had to go, I was hysterical.
How old were you at this point, sorry?
18.
So you say had to go, in the sense was there people saying this is what you
I feel like that was the way, this is how we deal with something, this is where you need to go, this is what will fix you.
Yeah. So did your adoptive parents know by this time that you'd worked out, or you'd found out this information?
Yeah, sorry. I obviously eventually at around 18, I told them that I knew, and that's how, it was thought that we best put some support in place.
Yeah, but obviously the choice of support doesn't seem to have been that well informed, is a nice way of putting it. Crikey. So then that leaves you does this leave you in a position where actually help is actually dangerous? Where do you go from here?
I think it can be. I think that talking about experiences can, like for me, it was re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
So I was more re-traumatized than I was actually helped for a long time, which then, like I said, just had a knock-on effect of everything. So, mental health was kind of getting worse rather than getting better.
Yeah. And people couldn't see why, because you were, but you're going to therapy. What's
exactly.
the problem?
Then you get labelled, you get diagnosed with things, you get some medication.
Crikey. So it sounds like it's going into a much darker place. The trajectory is downwards, isn't it, at this point?
Yeah.
And the help is pushing you further down, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what happened? Tell me the steps.
I know. I mean, this went on for quite a few years.
Right.
And then I was given a new social worker, a new adopted support worker.
Yeah.
Who just seemed to have a completely different perspective.
Right.
On my situation, which obviously helped me a lot.
And what did they suggest? What was their approach that sort of began a different trajectory?
Well, there was still this belief that if I filled in some of the blanks, that would help me.
So that the implication that you need to meet people and you need to get the information.
So the meeting wasn't, that kind of moved to the side, which obviously I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
The information, I think, was what I thought might help me.
Right.
However,
you're smiling. There's a wry smile.
As you know, gaining information is quite challenging. It takes a long time.
Very potent, yeah.
So I obviously wanted access to files.
Yeah.
And I was told that could be possible. Except I needed my biological mother's permission to do that.
Right. It's not funny, but you're laughing.
It's not funny, I know.
So you're young, early 20s, and you're an adult, but you can't find out your own story.
No, even though it was all in the paper.
Yeah. So that puts you in an almost impossible. As much as the meeting with your mum has been put aside, your birth mum, the sort of thing but that is a path you've got to travel in some way. You've got to contact her, or.
So somebody needed to reach out and ask her for permission because she still had parental responsibility.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So did that happen?
It did. And that was quite just knowing that I needed to ask her for permission was that was another challenge in itself. It added a lot of shame. Again, it just added more layers of not understanding why. I could never understand why someone who had committed a crime still seemed to have all this control.
Yeah.
And I had to, it just felt like I was the one who'd done something wrong.
It's all on you, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all on you to fix this, but everyone else holds the keys.
Yes.
And so did you pick someone who could go and sort of mediate for you, or reach out, or?
So the social worker that I was working with, obviously she did all of that, because it wouldn't have been safe to have not done it any other way.
Yeah.
And she was very good in terms of negotiating and making sure boundaries were still in place, and that the other side knew why I wanted this information.
So was the concern that your biological mother would perhaps think that this was you were wanting a relationship with her, or was there just a concern that she would then sort of, because in the midst of all that, I guess I'm being really, I'm trying not to be sort of really intrusive, but obviously so this is a woman who's dangerous. And that's not, let's not mess around, that she's a dangerous woman. She's committed the worst crime.
Yes.
But then you're having to go to her sort of cap in hand and say, can I have this information? But in no way wanting were you in any point wanting a relationship with her, or was it just totally, I just say yes, and that's the end of that?
It was totally that I wanted just the information, and it was unfortunate that we needed her permission.
But you wanted to make it clear to her that that was all you wanted. You didn't want anything else.
That was made very clear to her. However, I don't know what happened the other side of that, because she did have a very fantasized idea about what me asking for information meant. So again, that was just another layer of, what is anyone telling her the other side? Like, why is nobody telling her that you are a convicted murderer, and this is not what she is asking for?
It's just not even on the agenda. It's never going to happen at, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so did she give permission?
She did give permission.
Right.
But she also then started she sent a letter with that.
Right. So again, it's all about her.
It's all, exactly. It's all about her. And then I have to be notified that, a letter's been received, because that's just how it goes. And then from then on, she kept sending letters.
And do you think she knew what was going on, that there was a sense, because that puts you in a terrible position, because you want no contact, but there's a letter sat in an office that says something about you or to you or something. How do you manage that? Is there a temptation to look at the letter, or is it totally just burn them?
I feel like I didn't know what to ask for. I didn't know what my needs were. And I felt like, because I briefly sort of said no, I assumed that everyone knew that I didn't want contact. I assumed that everyone could see what I could see, but it didn't feel like that. And obviously, it was explained that if a letter comes to an adoption agency, they have to notify you. Yeah. Which makes sense, but it still felt a bit.
But then it's just got the potential to be coercive, hasn't it?
Yes.
If there's another letter, there's another letter, there's another letter. It removes your choice, and it's in a form of control. Well, it could be seen as a form of control, couldn't it?
Yeah.
If that's the intent of the person.
Which I think it was.
Right. So there's two things there then. So you got your information, but you've also got this kind of these letters stacking up at the social work office. So what did you access your information?
Okay, so the information, I had to go to somewhere to access the information. I had to sign lots of pieces of paper, and I think up until that point, lots of the experiences I'd had within were quite horrific, quite traumatic. And I remember going to this place with my social worker, and it was probably the most profound thing that she said to me before we walked in was, you probably just need to prepare yourself for what you find in these files is probably not going to be very nice. And I feel like that was the most honest thing that anyone had said to me.
Right. Just sort of calling it out for what it was.
Yeah.
And what did you find? Can you tell me? Do you want to tell me?
So
you don't have to tell me.
I don't know. It's fine. So I went to see these files, and at that point, I can't remember who it was, but I received another letter from my biological mother at that time, and It was just, again, it was boundaries. It was, that's not what I'm here for. So there was that, and that kind of threw me a little bit, because again, it was like, this is still invading something that I want to, I'm asking to do something and I'm still having to deal with something else.
Yeah.
The files were, so my files were tampered with, is the first thing that I should tell you.
What does that mean? I mean, what?
So when I went to visit my files, there were loads of files, and there was a lot about, obviously, my sibling and her, what her life had been up to, that what happened. And I found this piece of paper that said, before we let me look at the files, that I need careful scrutiny, because it's a high profile case, and it just said that anything with liability on it needs to be removed.
Well, that says enough. You don't have to find anything, do you? That says enough that there is a story there, isn't there?
Yeah, there definitely is a story there. But the things that were in the file were less than desirable. And again, you just think, I don't know what anyone was doing. I mean, you know, some of the things that I read were just... And I remember writing things down because I couldn't quite comprehend that what I was reading was real.
Yeah.
So I had this notebook with things that I've copied because you can't rationalise.
I guess you just overloaded, aren't you? It's such an emotive moment anyway, but then to try and make sense of what you're reading.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you know, my sister did not have a great life. She was on the at-risk register the whole time, and there were so many things that happened, and you just think, why was she not moved?
It's terrible. So where do you go from there?
Where do I go from there? So where did I go from there was then I spent, you know, a couple of years after that still receiving these letters, still having to go back to the, you know, adoption agency to go and just acknowledge that this letter has arrived. And they were just saying the same thing. They were, you know, that again, they were very fantasized letters. They were all about her. And you know, I remember saying one day, why do I keep getting these? Why is no one saying, can you stop writing these? And my social worker, I remember she made it was just an off the cuff remark, and she said to me, I think the only person who will ever be able to tell her that you don't want any contact is you. And
so it's all on you again.
And I don't think she meant it like that. I think it was just, you know, I didn't take that in an offensive way. It's just
stating fact.
Yeah. And then after a while, I thought, do you know what? Maybe it needs to be me that tells her.
So how old were you at this point?
So I was late 20s.
Right.
I was late 20s, and I discussed it with my with my social worker, and they decided that obviously I was in the right headspace. I did have the capacity. I did have the awareness to be able to do something like that. But we obviously we spent nearly a year before I actually made that contact, making sure we had ticked and crossed off all the what ifs.
Yeah.
How are we going to manage this? And I think that's really important in regards to contact.
Yeah.
Because the after effect of that can be equally damaging.
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like a hugely complicated, emotionally and logistically issue. Mm-hmm. And so, was it a planned face-to-face, or was it just a letter? What was the intention?
It was planned face-to-face.
Right. And so, did that happen?
It did. It happened in 2010.
Right.
And it was an incredibly surreal experience, because obviously contact for me was in a high secure place. I was strip searched. I had to leave all my stuff. There was a slight discrepancy about who I was when I arrived, because I didn't want to put my name down on anything.
Yeah, these reoccurring themes. Who am I? Who do you want me to be?
Yeah, exactly. But again, fortunately enough, the person that we worked with on the other side, he was, he was incredible. He really was. So when we got to that point, he just dealt with it. He didn't make any, there was no hoo-ha. He was just like, going to deal with this. It's fine. Let's continue. So, I am grateful for some of the people who walked some of my journey with me.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yeah. What happened then?
So you get a meeting room. And I was fine for the first few minutes, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, I freaked out just a little bit, because I realised that I was about to come face to face with not only biological mother, but somebody who, has committed murder. So I think my senses kind of kicked in a little bit there.
I mean, that's each one, those two things in of themselves are huge things.
Mm-hmm.
Huge things, but this is so on one level, if I can be frank, this is the murderer of your sister.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the woman who is your mother. That's just off the scale, isn't it?
Yeah. So after that, obviously, I sort of calmed down. I was just prepared for her to come in, and obviously everything had been, in terms of who was sitting where, what the distance was, all of that had been all really planned out. And yeah, obviously I came face to face with her. She still had a very fantasized idea about what role I should play in her life.
Mm-hmm. What did she want? I mean, can I ask you, what did she want what do you think she wanted from you?
I think she wanted a relationship with me.
So just play a nice mum and daughter.
Yeah.
Live happily ever after.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so was it a brief meeting? Was it were you just there in your head, were you there just to communicate, leave me alone, or what were you looking for?
I think there was part of me that wanted her to recognise what she had done, because all of the letters that she sent me never addressed anything. However, interestingly enough, she just didn't. It felt like she didn't even know what I was talking about.
Right. And so what did you? Was it a brief meeting? What did you say? And did you feel you got what you needed out of the meeting?
I feel like I did, because I felt like I also needed to tell her, and I know we've briefly touched on at the beginning about who I am, and I find that difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
But I did feel like I needed to tell her some of who I was, because I wanted to know that I wasn't going to be her.
Mm.
Because that was another thing that obviously worried me, that I was going to turn out like her.
Yeah. And so did that meeting stop the letters? Did it draw a line under it for her as well as you, or?
I don't think it's ever drawn a line for her, because at the end of that meeting, she wanted to hug me, and she'd been categorically told that is just a no, and she had to be moved away, because she thought that was an acceptable thing.
Just this fantasy.
yeah, exactly. So after my visit, a little while after, I wrote to her, I think just for me, for kind of just ultimate closure. And interestingly enough, she wrote back a year later.
Right.
And she started the letter with, sorry it's taken me so long to get back to you, I've been busy.
Right. Yeah. When you're laughing, but
I know,
it's tragic, isn't it?
It is tragic. And then she just continued with the same kind of stuff that she'd always put in letters. So
do you still get notifications? Do you still get letters?
No.
Right.
No.
But was that sort of a turning point for you? Did it achieve, in the sense of drawing a line under some things, or as much as you can ever draw a line under that sort of stuff?
I think as much as you ever can draw a line under that. I think, interestingly enough for me, as my adult life has continued, I've really kind of understood that I've also made choices based on some of my childhood trauma in terms of relationships I've chosen. So it kind of doesn't exactly, it didn't end for a while because I was still repeating certain patterns. I was still attracting certain types of people.
Right. So it's a work in progress. It's always going to be part of you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or part of your story.
Exactly.
I find it really interesting because I think that I see you hovering around conversations online, around contact, around working with birth families, and you were mentioning earlier, because I know that you're a trustee of the Open Nest, which is pro contact, pro family support, pro keeping children with their families as much as possible, which is all laudable and absolutely right. But your story is not that story, is it?
I feel like what would be really great is if we shared experiences rather than assume narratives.
Right.
We don't all have the same experiences. We didn't all get the same set of circumstances to navigate. It would be unfair for me to assume that my circumstances are somebody else's circumstances. I know, and obviously know my circumstances are quite unique, but I mean in terms of assuming that all biological parents are not nice people. But then on the other side of that, actually there are some, children are removed from circumstances which aren't great.
Yeah, and that's putting it nicely.
That's putting it nicely, yeah.
And so do you find yourself, is there a tension when, because in some ways the pendulum swung where there's a huge movement to say we need to keep families together as much as possible, or even I've heard said we should always keep families together, there's always a way, but that's not true, is it? I mean, for all families, that's not your story.
It's not true, is it? There are different things happening behind the scenes, I guess. There's more than one narrative, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I know we've talked and you've been really open with your story, but I know that you've told me 10% of your story. Because it's really difficult, but it's really personal. And is that a real challenge? How much of you give and how much you share? And
I think if I that is because of some of the choices that I've made later in life.
Right.
I have been open to people using my experiences to try and convince me that I am the same. I was talking specifically about a relationship that I was in, and my childhood trauma was used to try and convince the people around me that I was crazy.
Right.
So that makes you so much more vulnerable, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you start to think, well, everyone's going to see what this person supposedly sees.
Yeah, they're a result of that. That's why they're like this. It's because of that, and that's.
Yes. Yeah.
But I just find it remarkable that you put yourself out there, because I know you do.
It's hard, isn't it? Because then that also triggers lots of different feelings, such as rejection.
Yeah.
Abandonment, all of those things that are already there from the beginning.
Yeah, it knocks the scab off, doesn't it? Pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Putting yourself out there really, really quickly. I mean, is there anything that you'd like to say that I've not asked, or anything? Is there any points that you want to share that I've not raised?
I think for me as a person, I think it is, some of the trauma that I experienced was because people assumed that I should feel a certain way about certain things, and that added more trauma. So I feel like we shouldn't assume that younger adoptees feel a certain way, or that they're not allowed to feel things that aren't the majority feeling that's out there at the moment. I feel like that can do more harm than good.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you're answering that, this idea that actually there's two things going on in your story, isn't it? There's the story that comes from your origins,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's the story of how that was then managed.
Yep.
And they're two very distinct, but they both have brought challenge and adversity and trauma to you.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it, but yeah, that is really, there's a real lesson there, isn't there, for anyone who works with anyone who experiences trauma. Are you part of the solution or the part of the problem?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That's a really glib sort of, phrase, isn't it? But life and death for some people. Well, Fran, thank you so much. It's a really difficult subject matter, and you've been really open, and I know that it comes at a cost, so I thank you so much, and look after yourself.
Thank you.